So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Masira webinar on High Skills Higher Ed, the uni/vet connection. My name is Luke Harris, and I'm a media officer with the Media Centre for Education Research Australia. Before we do begin today, I'd like, in the spirit of reconciliation, Masira acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. For myself, that is the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains region, and that we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this meeting will be recorded and available to our Masira subscribers. I do acknowledge that maybe some of you here today who are not from our Masira subscriber partners, which we do welcome. And if this is you, and if you'd like to know a bit more about Masira and what we do, we have our General Manager, Bindi Taylor, on hand who can answer questions directly. We also have our Media Officer, Brendan Deffenmore, present, who will be moderating this webinar and will be able to assist with questions. Earlier this month, the federal government announced a landmark national skills agreement to inject $12.6 billion into Australia's vet and TAFE sector. The 5-year deal aims to transform the sector by supporting quality training and implement reforms to address shortages in critical skills needs. As part of the agreement, major reforms will include the establishment of nationally networked TAFE centres of excellence, involving partnerships between TAFEs, universities, jobs and skills and councils industry. To facilitate this announcement and to help you understand a bit more about what this means for the future of tertiary education in Australia, Masira, alongside the Western Sydney University, the Griffith Institute for Educational Research, and the Australian Association for Research in Education, have gathered some of the nation's leading voices to discuss talking points surrounding the National Skills Agreement. Our first speaker today is Professor Michelle Simons. Professor Simons is the Dean of Education at Western Sydney University and Treasurer of the AARE. A respected researcher and a winner of a number of nationally competitive grants from the Australian Research Council and the National Vocational Education and Training Research and Evaluation Program. She has extensive experience in the fields of adult education, vocational education, and workplace learning, and the secondary teacher education. Professor Simons will be speaking on how educators and teachers can be supported to deliver these changes in the sector to ensure the quality of education and training can be realised. Following Michelle, we have Associate Professor Stephen Hodge from the Griffith University. Stephen is Deputy Head of School of Research in the School of Education and Professional Studies with the Griffith Institute for Educational Research. He is the immediate past president of the Australian Vocational Education and Training Association and a key contributor to debate in Australian post-compulsory education. Associate Professor Hodge will be speaking about the necessity for a more functional tertiary sector to support the workplace of the future. Each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes of speaking time, followed by a Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you'd like to ask any questions during the webinar, please post any questions that you may have, either during or after their speeches in the chat box, and I'll ask them at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Simons to the stage.
Good evening or morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. What I'm going to do today is to talk about three key points. The first, but to start with, the policy goals that Luke outlined are part of a suite of a range of policies that are being promulgated by the current federal government in the area of education. And many of you may also be familiar with the Australian government's white paper, Working Futures. And that is underpinned by the need to develop and sustain a workforce suitable for an integrated tertiary education sector, of which vocational education will be one part. And like all sectors of our economy, the effectiveness of the workforce that is assembled to work in this integrated tertiary sector is going to be critical to delivering the high quality learning experiences which will meet the needs of industries and the increasingly diverse student populations that will need to engage with this sector, and particularly those students who are coming from groups that have been often underserved by education. So in this presentation, I'm going to make 3 moves. The first one is I'm going to have a look at the tertiary sector, just how and what it's like in a general sense. Then I'm going to just look at the workforces and how they are similar and different. So contrasting the vocational education workforce and the higher education workforce. and then looking towards the idea of, well, what does a workforce capable of sustaining an integrated tertiary education sector look like? So where are we now? Historically, the workforces of the vocational and higher education sectors have developed along relatively independent trajectories, each with its own particular sets of cultures and structures and processes, which have shaped the attraction, retention, and development of its educators and other professionals who work in them. Education policies have supported these sectoral differences while encouraging the notion of pathways and connections or partnerships between the two sectors. And there's obviously considerable debate around the efficacy or the value of these pathways and how will they work when the goal is an integrated tertiary sector. But the higher and vocational education sectors that have evolved over time are not homogenous entities within themselves. And this is becoming increasingly evident as institutions move to address these new policy imperatives of greater integration across the sectors. As many of you will know, the VET sector has overlaps with secondary schools through the provision of vocational education in schools programs. And the VET providers themselves are incredibly diverse. There's over 4,000 of them, which include TAFE, commercial, adult and community, industry and enterprise-based providers, some of whom do also offer qualifications such as degrees that are associated with the university sector. Each of these different groups of providers address different markets, and they hold contrasting worldviews about the work of people engaged in the education and training services that they provide. And while some of these differences may be more ideological than real, as noted by Carmel and Shreve, that it is clear from a number of studies that these institutions have grown up with their own sets of ways of operating in the context or industries in which they serve. And likewise, you would be familiar with higher education itself not being uniform, having within its remit what has been known as a miscellany of other colleges, as described by Moody. These are distinguished either by the field of study or the industry they serve, and they include religious and not-for-profit colleges and commercial for-profit entities. And we also see the emergence of some dual sector institutions, which have been a feature of the education landscape. These within sector differentiations add a layer of complexity when we start to consider the blurring of the higher and vocational education sectors and the implications that this has for the shape of the aspirations for a tertiary sector that is both more integrated, agile, and responsive. And within this current context, we're already starting to see the emergence of new entities. And an example of this is the Institutes for Applied Technology, the IATs, in New South Wales. So the current policy settings place higher and vocational education providers in somewhat of a crossroad, where both are now implicated in a project to develop a more highly qualified and skilled workforce for Australia and to enable access and participation to post-school education to a far wider range of people than ever before. Both sectors will need to be able to respond to greater diversity in the student populations they serve, which will in turn focus attention on the provision of highly personalised, innovative approaches to personal and skill development that meet industry and wider societal needs. For entry-level and continuing education purposes, these sectors will also need to respond to the trends in the spreads of technology, including AI, and the use of a range of peer and collaborative and networked learning across sites, including workplaces, as noted by Billett and other researchers. And this project needs to be fulfilled within the context of a tertiary education sector that aspires to carry the hallmark of coherency, to be clear and consistent and sound, both in appearance and outputs, while also ensuring that the sectors will also have their distinctive features maintained. So universities and their links to the professions, high status professions in particular, and their connections with research, and for VET, its industry-led character expressed through things like the use of training packages, which I know Stephen is going to address in his talk. So what about this workforce that has to work in this integrated sector? So currently, their respective workforces, like the respective institutions, have grown up within various silos with little or if any overlap in terms of the manner in which they've been developed. They do have similar characteristics, though. They're similar in terms of their age profiles, the casualised nature of the respective workforces, and the capability development needed to enable staff to integrate technologies into teaching and learning and improve the engagement of students within their learning environments. These are all areas of concern. We know that the vet sector workforce is made up of a range of practitioners, including teachers and trainers and assessors and other professional staff working in a wide range of different types of organisations. And workers in these sectors can be employed in a variety of different ways, and they can be self-employed as consultants, or they can be employed in other occupations and also work as an assessor or trainer alongside that main occupation. And the work of a number of researchers has illustrated the complexity in the development of this very myriad of complex workforce. The vocational educational workforce too is also noted for its mobility. A study that was conducted in careers, it's a little bit old now, in around 2010, found that 2/3 of the respondents reported that they had made between 1 and 5 moves during their employment in the vet sector. So this self-directed career behaviour and intra-sector mobility is a marker of a workforce that potentially could be characterised as being flexible and agile, but it is also a workforce of high churn, which presents significant challenge for the sustainability of the workforce. One of the most contentious issues related to the capability of vocational education has been the level of qualifications needed to work effectively as a teacher. And current regulatory requirements mandate a Certificate 4 in training and assessment, usually alongside relative vocational qualifications. I must say that similar minimalist approaches to teaching qualification requirements are also a feature in for academic staff in higher education providers. And in both cases, these baseline qualifications need to be supported by ongoing professional development and other strategies to build capability development. And this has been outlined in a lot of research, particularly led by Bevan Clayton, Hugh Guthrie, and has also been called out in the Productivity Commission reports. So what does all this mean? It means that in order to develop a tertiary sector, we need to think about the qualification mix that needs to drive the aspiration of having this highly skilled education workforce to meet the aspirations we have for this sector. We need to think about the combination of the qualified educators that we need. We need to also think about the ways in which other issues such as industrial relations and the regulatory environment may impede or impact on the sort of workforce that might be able to be realised. And I think the other thing that is also really important is to think about the ways in which these workforces need to be supported in order to be able to provide the quality of learning that is needed in order to meet the diverse range of needs of students. So I think in conclusion, I think be wanting to say that we need a systematic and thoughtful approach to the skills and the development of this tertiary education workforce. It can't just be left to chance. And the sorts of qualifications and the sorts of ongoing professional development that we offer this workforce will in fact determine the ways in which it actually operates and will realise this integration that's aspired to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Simons, for your insight into that. And just as a reminder as well, if anyone in the audience does have any questions they'd like to ask Professor Simons or Associate Professor Hodge, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll ask them at the end of today's webinar. But without further ado, I'll invite Associate Professor Hodge to the stage, who will be talking about what he's going to talk about.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this incredibly important area. I'd like to just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work, the Yagarabal, Yagara, Jagera and Turrbal peoples. Now, the topic that we're looking at today, stemming from the white paper and its vision for a functional tertiary sector, raised the point that we're talking about an incredibly complicated issue. It's an issue that, in a way, has been concocted by waves and waves and waves of government policy. So the fact that we have a vocational education and training sector and a higher ed sector, and that they have differences in terms of their identities and histories and aspirations, is in part the doing of governments over time. So it's interesting when a white paper comes out and stands back and is kind of seeing that other policies have pushed us into a situation where we've got really a split down the middle of tertiary provision between vet and higher education. So it's a complicated area. It's an incredibly interesting area, but also it's fundamentally important to activate the tertiary sector as a functional sector of education for the future of Australia's economy. Because we're in a situation where the old ways of preparing people for their careers are breaking down, and we need to be able to offer workers and entrants into the workforce ways to traverse the entire spectrum of tertiary education without being held up artificially. Industries need that, individuals need that. So it's incredibly important for us to be thinking about how to create a functional tertiary sector. Now, what I'll do is draw on some fairly recent research that Elizabeth Knight and myself did for the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. And this was research that attempted to explore efforts to combine vet and higher education qualifications. So these are recurrent initiatives, sometimes from vet providers, sometimes from higher ed providers, sometimes from governments of different levels, to combine the best of maybe a diploma and a degree. Now, of course, if you're aware of the Australian Qualifications Framework, diplomas, advanced diplomas, associate degrees and degrees all kind of operate in the middle of the Australian Qualifications Framework. And it makes sense for industries and skills that are positioned around those bands to be served by qualifications that strictly speaking span vet and higher education. So the project that we did was interested in examples of integrated qualifications. When we looked closely at the history of these initiatives and the problems associated with them, we discovered, first of all, that there are multiple dimensions of difference between vet and higher education. What you have listed here are just a few key dimensions. So we're saying that there are differences in terms of the way curriculum is approached. There are differences in the way that pedagogy or teaching is done. There are differences in the way that assessment is performed. The teaching workforce, as Michelle explained, there are differences there, and we need to overcome those differences. There's differences in regulation and funding and market positioning. So there are multiple dimensions of difference, and a functional tertiary sector would be one where some of the barriers at these different levels or dimensions are overcome. What I'd like to just focus in on is the curriculum dimension. And it will become clear why I think the curriculum dimension is particularly important. Now, if we look at higher education and vet from a curriculum perspective, we can say that there's something very different going on in the vet sector. The vet sector around 30 years ago was reformed, and it was reformed in a time of real need in Australia's economy during the 80s. There were various pressures on Australian society that had to be addressed. And one of the things that governments at the time did was reform the vet sector in order to completely change how industry and the sector supporting industry skills operated, so that it would become a competitive global economy that we were supporting. Now, part of that reform involved imposing a single curriculum model on the entire sector. The curriculum model is competency-based training, CBT, and it is, from one perspective, a wonderful way to activate an entire educational sector for the national interest. So at the time, CBT made wonderful sense in terms of getting vet behind the needs of the economic needs of the nation. So 30 years ago, CBT was a policy masterstroke, I would say. At the same time, although competency-based education was something that reformers played with in terms of higher education has largely resisted that kind of influence. And so what you find today is that higher education has an ad hoc curriculum approach where individual institutions and disciplines and professions are served in completely different ways in terms of curriculum models. On the whole, the curriculum models used in higher education are tied back to the way particular disciplines and professions see themselves. So engineers see themselves in a certain way. They articulate standards that are taken by higher ed providers and turned into curriculum. Over on the vet side, however, what we have is this CBT, this competency-based approach. And what it means is that all qualifications of a particular kind, say a diploma in nursing, are going to have the same outcomes or the same stated outcomes. Doesn't matter the provider, doesn't matter the size of the provider or the jurisdiction. All those diplomas of nursing are the same. But the point is that although the consistency is desirable, the architecture of those qualifications, which is provided by CBT, may or may not articulate with that profession, in this case, the profession of nursing. There are many other examples where different industries ask for something different of vocational education and training. However, in each of these cases, they have to go through the bottleneck or the filter of CBT and training packages, as they're called, which are the kind of the administrative envelopes around units of competency. So what we have today is a situation where higher ed has escaped the yoke of something like CBT and continues to serve industries, professions, disciplines in an ad hoc way, which happens to work if industries are changing quickly and need skills that are evolving so rapidly that you need a curriculum response that's really, really quite quick. Over on the vet side, because of that consistency among qualifications, there's a whole machinery of units of competency, revision and updating and endorsement that slows that process right down. So what I think the point to consider when we're talking about a functional tertiary sector and perhaps a more effective vet sector within that is to look at ways to reduce the impact of CBT on curriculum making in the vet sector. See, providers like TAFEs and private RTOs, have the expertise, have the creativity, have the insight to be able to create curriculum that really suits particular employers. But first, they have to refer back to the competency-based training model before they can go forward and serve those industries. It seems quite clear now that CBT has perhaps it's done good work in the past. It's no longer the case that it's necessarily supporting VET, and the government indeed is embarking on a qualifications reform process where CBT is being looked at. So I'm glad that that's happening. It augurs well for the future and for a functional tertiary sector. If we can wind back some of the constraints that come with CBT and unleash the creativity and the expertise of trainers, teachers, providers, then we can be looking forward to a much more flexible and powerful tertiary sector in future. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your insight into that and the differences between VET and higher education. Now, this is the time for any questions if anyone would like to ask anything. We have a question here from Paishan Seat, who says, both speakers use the terms like integrated and combined tertiary education sector quite a few times in their presentations. This appears to hark back to what things were like pre-1990s and points to a suggestion of a hard or tight relationship between VET and higher education. However, changes in both VET and higher education in the last 30 plus years that have embedded these institutional differences. Also, given the uncertainty from technological and other disruptions affecting the future of work, won't a more soft or loose relationship work better, i.e. such as the collaboration and flexibility that promotes agility and responsiveness and provide a better framework for lifelong continuous learning? Maybe Stephen, if you, that's probably the best question for you to ask.
That's a great question, Paishan. And it really relates to that research that I was describing earlier of the attempt to integrate qualifications. That's a very tight model. It's an idealistic model, but as it turns out, the evidence was that it was a pretty unrealistic model. What you're talking about with a looser relationship, I think is a very good way forward. But just bearing in mind that VET to enter into a more kind of fluid relationship is still constrained by training packages and CBT. So if that can be relaxed a little bit, we could be looking at a much more fluid relationship between the two components of the tertiary sector.
No worries. And Associate Professor Kate Williams has asked, would you say that those university degrees that are industry accredited, such as education, have some of the same challenges of CBT on the VET sector, i.e. less agile or more administrative burden or bottlenecks for course changes? Or perhaps there is more flexibility at the unit level, if not at the course level? Is that who would like to answer that question if possible?
Look, I'll have a crack, and Stephen might want to have a go too. Yes, Kate, I think there can be a perception, particularly with education degrees, that increasingly they are becoming very regulated, all under the guise of wanting to improve the quality of the graduates that it produces, and it does create some challenges. But I do think Stephen's point is correct in that universities are self-accrediting authorities who can choose the curriculum models that they use, do have greater flexibility. But then other regulatory arrangements in the higher education sector and even within the institutions themselves, where they have to go through extended accreditation processes and have policies in place to guide that, which enables them to be self-accrediting, can in fact act as a bottleneck. And I think that one of the key words for the workforces in these two sectors is going to be, how do we get agility? And agility, the work of an educator is always guided by the curriculum, as Stephen has pointed out. So how we have to look at the levers that sit around that, but also I think we actually have to have a workforce that can take advantage of that agility or that flexibility that was talked about And to some degree, where I sit, one of the challenges is the HE sector and the vet sector often don't know each other well. They actually don't know how each other works. It's a bit like a primary teacher sometimes not being quite sure how a secondary school works. Some part of this lies in actually building some commonality across the sectors so we understand each other, in my view.
Okay, now there's a question that has found its way to me, but I really would like to just add to what Michelle has just said, going back to, I think it was Kate's question. Thanks for that question, Kate. I think there's reason to be quite nervous about the inroads of accreditation regimes. Having studied vet for so long, whenever I smell anything that sounds like CBT, that looks like CBT, I get nervous, and I am a little bit concerned about the inroads of accreditation requirements on the curricular creativity of higher education institutions, because our teachers, our administrators are incredibly capable people, and can easily interpret standards and turn them into curriculum. That's no real problem. But if we had a more draconian approach to these standards, where perhaps courses were being aligned to standards and substandards, we'd end up with something like a competency-based system, and we would lose a lot of the creativity, the innovation that's possible in higher education. Not that higher education has set out to do this; it just happens to have escaped the impost of CBT. And then I've got a question that's just come in from Brendan.
I might just read that out quickly, just for the
yes, please.
So Brendan from Masira has asked, Stephen, can you give us something of an example of what happens when a vet provider, such as the TAFE, comes up against some of the constraints of CBT when they're trying to do something a bit more outside the box?
Yes. So that's a really good question. Speaking very recently to a training provider about how they respond to industries that need to develop skills that fall outside the training package system. What was described to me was that only a certain fraction of what this actual large employer wanted could be found in training packages. What the provider had to do was then go outside the training package system to look for bespoke models that had been accredited in other states. If other states haven't tried something that works, they then have to build a non-accredited component to these qualifications from the ground up. And one of the interesting things here is that the type of skills and knowledge required for that are so rare. Of course they're rare. It's a really odd thing to be asking a provider to do, to try and juggle so many contending frameworks to come up with a good solution for those they are out to serve. So the constraints of the system mean that providers have to bend over backwards to stay within the rules, and all of this gets in the way of curricular creativity, which the providers could definitely exercise if they're allowed to.
Thanks for that, Stephen. And I think we've got time for a few more questions here. We do have another one here for Michelle. Do you see much happening at the moment that is creating a framework for vets and university sectors to get to know each other better?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think the example that I would go to is the Institute of Applied Technology as an example of what's happening. So these are entities that to some degree are neither higher education nor vet sector entities. They sit between them. And the idea that they are created as entities and they blend together the academy and industry and TAFE and private providers to specifically work towards developing micro-credentials and qualifications for specific industry. So we have one in digital technologies here in New South Wales and another one in construction that is also. So these are examples where it's almost like you have to create a new sandbox where people can go and play free from free from the constraints and the regulatory constraints, to find out what is possible. And I think these IoTs are really interesting in that, particularly the digital technologies one that has been going for a bit longer than the construction one, to see the uptake of what is being produced in that industry. So maybe part of this lies in the idea of how these third spaces, which can be created, which can bring together the two with industry and other stakeholders to actually work free of those constraints. But what we need, as Stephen has said, is a regulatory framework that enables that. It's no good to say that we can create these really exciting and innovative courses and then find that the accreditation or the regulatory framework is so cumbersome that it doesn't work. But this is where also I think the involvement of industry becomes quite important, because ultimately they, as the receivers of qualifications and qualified graduates, need to understand what's being produced. And if they're key stakeholders in this, that can be part of it. So I'm optimistic that I think we can see that creativity. But as Stephen has said, we need to think about some of the constraints. But we also need a workforce that actually does, spending time with each other and working with each other is often the best way to know each other.
Yeah, could I just add to that? A project that colleagues and I did some years ago on higher ed offerings within TAFE institutions found, among other things, that yes, there was the kind of mutual misrecognition problem that Michelle was talking about, but it was actually worse for the higher ed folks. The higher ed folks had far less idea of what was going on in vet than the vet folks had of higher ed. So there's that was just an interesting thing, that a number of higher ed providers, in a sense, indirectly in competition with the higher ed offerings of large vet providers, were not even aware that vet providers could offer higher ed. That it was just not on their radar whatsoever, and it was a surprise to them. Whereas the vet sector folks were very clear about the kind of market they were working in and the relationships and the status kind of perceptions going on there, which is quite a problem.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we have time for maybe one more question if you guys are okay with this. And it might be a bit more of a political question, so apologies if it's not really sort of in your forte or if you don't want to answer it. But I want to touch upon the prospect of fee-free TAFE, where a couple of governments have basically partnered with TAFEs. I know it's a thing here in South Australia, where there are certain TAFE courses which are offered to students where basically they're not paying any fees to attend these courses and get their credentials and qualifications. Could you see this sort of continuing post-reform? How could that continue to benefit upskilling our workforce, but also could that hinder university enrollments and sort of university future prospects? Is that linked to you, Stephen, or?
Oh, yeah, I could look. I haven't done much research here, but the question, yeah, it's a broad question, isn't it? So, there's a couple of things. Of course, if governments have the funds and can, at their level, understand the needs of industry, it's a way to drive up the skills of the workforce in a very rapid way. There'd be other questions though about whether these kinds of measures have any kind of future. And it would always be worth thinking about whether students enrolling into these courses always respect what's on offer. If you pay for something, you have a different attitude to it. So I do wonder whether some of the vet providers who are enrolling students under these programs would have anything to say about the attitude of their students and the kind of retention too. What kind of value for money governments are getting from this.
Look, can I offer something slightly different? I think one of the things is that, as I understand it, these are fee-free TAFE courses, so they're aimed at the public sector, not the private sector. I think that's correct. And one of the things that we need to remember, and Stephen will know this, that when all the reforms that he talked about started in the 1980s and 90s, one of the other reforms was around creating a training market. And we saw a flood of private training providers come in simply because they thought that TAFE in and of itself was unable going to be able to meet the demands for skills that were needed at the time. So there was a rationale behind creating this private training market. But over time, what has happened, the challenges to the public sector was that it was diminished as it was required to compete with the private sector, to the point where many TAFEs now have lost a lot of their capacity that they might have had in the past. So part of this is, I think, a broader question of asking, we have public and private schools. What is, in an integrated tertiary sector, what is the role of a public provider like TAFE? What role does it have to play? And what role do other private providers have to play? And how does this mix of public and private play out? Because we don't have a settlement like we have in the schooling sector. We have an antagonistic relationship where many of the private providers would look askance at TAFE being given the places over themselves. And as Stephen has said, asking questions about outcomes. But conversely, the role of the public provider in an integrated tertiary sector is a debate I think we have to have, because TAFEs have transformed out of sight over the time of the 30 years of the reforms. I don't know what Stephen thinks about that, but that's what I would think.
Lovely. And I think if it's possible, just one more question that we've had that come through. One of our audience wants to know about rural, remote, and regional context for communities. So what could this mean for those who are not in the major population centres, basically?
It probably is. We have to ask the very critical question, I think, Luke, about, how does this particularly address the question of the thin markets and the thin provision that already exists in regional and remote areas. And again, this is where I think we are seeing some, we have to think about new ways of being able to provide this, because the vocational education and training in particular, and to some extent higher education, has always struggled where there are thin markets. The models, the funding models and other things, and just don't make it very, very difficult. But again, I think we have to pressure test a lot of what is going on, because what we can do is, if we just keep the posts in place, it will just reproduce the inequality and the gaps in provision that we have. What we need to do is to say, well, what would an integrated tertiary provider look like in, say, a large regional area? How would it operate? What would it look like? Who would go there? How would we provide? And how would we, leverage technologies and other things to make sure, particularly those people that didn't go, traditionally could go. We have to pressure test all of these things. And we have to do that openly, because I think there are a lot of assumptions. Policies are not prescriptions. Policies set the running tracks. There's a lot of questions that we have to ask over time. But I think the rural and remote one is a great one. And again, it's one that has to be thought of alongside of how do we serve other populations of students that have not been well served, students with disability, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. There's a whole range of students that are not well served by what we have at the moment.
Lovely. Well, I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you, everyone. In particular, thank you very much, Professor Michelle Simons and Associate Professor Stephen Hodge, for coming along and presenting at this Masiro webinar today. Now, if you guys have any more questions as well, feel free to send them through to our email address, media@masiro.org.au. And what we can do, we can then forward them either to Professor Simons or Associate Professor Hodge and get them to answer it for you, hopefully. Other than that, yeah, it's been a lovely day. Thank you all for coming along. And I hope you have enjoyed basically the webinar and learned something of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.